Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the meeting tonight to discuss the interim remedial action work plan for the northern portion of the Missoula White Pine Sash facility proposed by Sparrow Group Development of Missoula, Montana. My name is Andrew Heltebridal, and I'm the Department of Environmental Qualities Project Officer for this facility. Up here at the table we have Chris Zircone of Maxim Technology, Denise Martin, DEQ SRS Section Supervisor, Cindy Brooks, DEQ Legal, Mike Trombetta, DEQ Bureau Chief, also Tim Gurman of Sparrow Group Development. The Department of Environmental Quality is the agency responsible for overseeing the cleanup of the Missoula White Pine Sash facility under Montana's Comprehensive Environmental Cleanup and Responsibility Act. DEQ doesn't typically submit interim action proposals for public comment. However, based upon concerns raised by the Missoula City County Health Department, DEQ and Sparrow Group has agreed to solicit public input on this proposal. I believe we have a number of issues to discuss tonight, and it's my hope that the meeting follows some established guidelines that we are providing in order to assure that everyone has a chance to provide some feedback tonight. First part of tonight's meeting will be a presentation by Chris Zircone of Maxim Technology. Sparrow Group has chosen Maxim Technology as its remedial contractor for the project, and Chris will be providing an overview of the proposed plan tonight. After Chris's presentation, we will be conducting a question and answer forum for everyone. We ask that those with questions position themselves at the microphones and limit themselves to 2 questions at a time before allowing the next person to voice their concerns. Certainly tonight you may ask more than 2 questions, but we ask that after asking your 2 questions, you return to the end of the line at the microphone, and I think this will enable individuals to ask their questions and also provide folks with an opportunity that have questions to have their questions addressed in a timely manner. After Chris's presentation, we'll be pushing back this podium here, and a microphone will be placed for people to come up to and speak. During the question and answer portion of our meeting, if at any time you think of additional questions, please come forward to the microphone and voice them. We ask that you please use the question and answer portion of tonight's meeting for just that purpose, questions you have about the proposal or things that you are unaware of. And following the question and answer portion of the meeting, anyone who has a statement to make regarding the proposal or what they have heard about tonight is encouraged to approach the microphone and voice their statement. But please again, save your statements for after the presentation and after the question and answer forum is conducted. As you see tonight, we have a court reporter is present to record the notes of tonight's meeting. DEQ will be reviewing the transcript of tonight's meeting, and it will take into consideration all issues and concerns brought up tonight. However, I need to emphasize that DEQ will only be providing a written response to individual comments that are submitted in writing. Comment period will end on April 19th, and comments are accepted via regular mail, fax, or email. If you need my email address or physical address, please see me after tonight's meeting or refer to the fact sheet that I have available on the table over there. It's a fact sheet that was issued last July, but does contain information where I can be reached and where comments can be sent to. Before I turn the meeting over to Chris, I'd like to clarify that DEQ is also reviewing this document while public comment period is going on. As mentioned, this will enable DEQ to reflect on issues presented here at the meeting, as well as those submitted in writing. After the public comment period, DEQ will issue its comments to Sparrow Group and Maxim Technologies in writing, and the public will be notified of DEQ's decision regarding the proposal. With that, I'd like to introduce Chris Zircone of Maxim Technologies and have him give his presentation.
Thanks, Amy. I'm going to need to walk around a little bit. Well, one, I got to push the button, and the other, I'll need to walk around. My name is Chris Zircone. I work for Maxim Technologies. I know quite a few people in this room. This evening, for about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes or so, I want to go over the draft cleanup plan, the proposed cleanup plan for the Missoula site. Take that. Hopefully everybody's gotten a packet when they came in. If they didn't, what I tried to do was make copies of the talk on here, and then the key figures are on here because I've been at these where it's difficult to see up front. And to This way you can have it right in your lap, and maybe once you can see what I'm talking about. So if anybody hasn't gotten one of these, feel free to come up and get one. There's still a stack up here. As I mentioned, I'm going to take about 30 minutes or so. What I'd like to go over is some background related to the contamination on the White Pine site, particularly the northern portion of the site, where the proposed residential redevelopment is proposed. And then I'm going to talk about specifics of the cleanup plan, both in terms of what would be physically done to clean up the site to residential standards, how samples would be collected. Some of you may have heard this talk in January. It's been improved upon that we've done a whole lot of work in terms of figuring out job sequencing, how the job might go, how the soil would be excavated, all those kinds of issues that I'm sure some of you may have concerns with. The contaminants concern for the site, being the northern portion of the site, and also these are contaminants concerned for the whole site, are pentachlorophenol and dioxin. The site has been divided into two main areas by the DEQ in terms of cleanup, and there's different cleanup standards, a little bit different cleanup standards for both the northern portion, which includes the city of Missoula's property and White Pine, and in this case, Scott Street Development property right now, which could be Sparrow's property, and then also the property that's owned to the south by Watkins, and then a portion that's still owned by the responsible party, in this case. Surface and subsurface soil contamination is present on the northern portion of the property. The majority of samples that have been collected to date are surface soil samples. There have been some subsurface soil samples, and there were some additional subsurface soil samples collected by the DEQ last week when we were out doing some field verification of fill depths out on the property. The potential exposure routes for the contaminants in the soil, in this case for dioxin, we're talking about a dermal, touch it, breathe it, and eat it. Okay, so it's a surface soil kind of contact, and that's how the cleanup standard for the site is established, using those exposure pathways. For PCP, the standard is established for protection of groundwater, potential groundwater contamination and ingestion of that groundwater via turning on the tap, spraying it somewhere, and being exposed to it on the ground. It's a groundwater contamination. The groundwater ingestion is the trigger in terms of the standard for PCP on the site. We have purged groundwater on the site, greater than 20 feet deep. It's present in some places and not present in other places. And the Missoula aquifer below that purged aquifer is about 45 feet down. The cleanup goals are the risk-based, you'll probably hear me say this quite a bit, the risk-based remedial goals for the site that were established in the risk assessment done on the site are 185 parts per billion for penta and 30 parts per billion for residential. There also is a commercial standard for docks and a 200 PPT that's been established for the site and a 2,000 PPT construction worker standard. As Andy had mentioned, the proposal is an interim remedial action plan or cleanup plan. It's proposed as an interim action, which is allowable under Montana administrative rules and law. It's actually used numerous times on secret sites, including it's been used quite a few times on this site already to date for soil vapor extraction, for groundwater pump and treat that's been ongoing by HUD. They've used interim actions in those cases. An interim action must be protected as to public health and environment as a non-interim action. And the agency, as Andy indicated, that's overseeing or has oversight approval for this project is the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. We'll talk a little bit about the risk assessment. The risk assessment was completed in 2001. The risk assessment defined the site-specific acceptable cleanup levels based on human health risk for both penta and dioxin, and those are the levels that I mentioned earlier. The 30 ppm dioxin, the 185 parts per million pentafluorophenols. To date, it is the most conservative risk assessment that's been done in the state of Montana. It used child defaults in a lot of their equations. It quantified both breathable intake in terms of how much you might be exposed. It also quantified breast milk exposure in terms of quantifying how much you could be exposed to without an adverse effect. The site is also, it was also conservative because they knew the site was adjacent to a neighborhood, and it was also conservative. They took conservative defaults in the risk assessment because there's a sole source aquifer below the site. Getting into the cleanup plan, which is probably why most of you are here. The basics of the cleanup plan are these four things. One is that Sparrow Group will remove fill and soil above residential cleanups levels for PCP and dioxin. As I mentioned, there are 185 parts per billion penta and 30 parts per billion dioxin. We will demonstrate that the residential cleanup levels have been met by sampling after the material has been removed and before new material, clean material is brought on the property. And I'll talk a little bit about that. See how that will work in a minute. The entire site will be covered after the material has been removed by a minimum of 2 feet of clean material on top of the property, and then additional material will be put on top of that to bring the property up to site grade. And we'll look at some of your figures, and we'll be talking about that. In some places, there'll be 23 feet of clean fill material. Most of the area will be 4, 6, 8 feet of clean material on the property. And the reason why is we've gone through and done quite a bit of work, and I'll talk about that, determining where this fill material is. It will provide for special utility and site construction techniques to prevent future exposure. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we are in the plan, the things that we're thinking about in terms of preventing potential for future exposure. Even though we're cleaning up to a residential standard already, we're going beyond that, and we're doing things to try to prevent someone from being exposed to it. Give you a sense of the cleanup flow chart. One of the first things that was done was to try to get a handle on the fill material that was out on the property. It was evident that there was a lot of wood waste, a lot of material could not construct the building on top of it. And in order to get our arms around that, we did a couple different things. One, we did a seismic survey across the property, transects across it, looked at seismic refraction data to determine where the fill was. It gives you a ballpark within plus or minus a foot or so. And then we went out and actually field verified that. We did about 40 or so test pits of several trenches to try to get the contacts for the old rock on. Where does the old rock going to start? Where does it stop? How deep is it? What does the material look like? What do we need to remove in order to make sure that we can build on this site? The other benefit of removing that fill material is it is a potential source of possible contamination. So by removing that fill material, we're removing a potential source. We're in step 2 right now. We're almost completing step 2, and that is to prepare an implementation plan. It's how you're going to do this. It's not going to be a small job. It's going to be a large job. It's going to be the physical removal of about 120,000 yards of material. And that's not a small job, particularly in an area of 20 acres in size where you've got to potentially stage soil and move things and do dust abatement and all those things that need to be done. And that plan is fairly formalized. The bid specification is this week. We're supposed to finish that up. We'll go out for bid next week. And there's going to be about a 2-week lag for people to make bids on the construction part. That is the excavation, which is step 3. You excavate the fill material and the contaminated soil above the residential risk-based remedial goals. Once that's done, step 4 comes into place, and that is, how do you verify that you've removed everything that you need to remove? In this case, we're proposing, using EPA guidance, sampling the site, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to grid it up, let samples demonstrate that we've met the residential cleanup standards. And that's all before the site's backfilled with any clean material at all. So that leads right into step 5, where you compare the site data to the residential RVRGs for the site, risk-based remedial goals. I apologize for acronyms, but that's what that stands for. If the data shows that we've met the residential cleanup standards, we go to step 6. If it doesn't, we go back to step 3, which is to excavate more material, or I'll show you how the sampling is done, do more finite sampling and try to figure out maybe where is that little hot spot in the area that we sampled, to go right to that spot and potentially remove it. If it is less than the residential standards, we will ask the DEQ for clearance to cover the site. And as you'll see, it'll be done in phases by sub-areas on the site. So for instance, sub-area 1, sub-area 2 we'll do first to clear it. We'll get it to the point where we need to sample it. We'll send the samples in. Are they good? Are they not good? If they're good, then we'll backfill that. And in order to backfill, we'll meet with the DEQ. DEQ is actively involved. We'll say, can we backfill that? They'll give us clearance. They won't give us no further action, but they'll give us a sense that yes, you've met those standards and you can backfill those areas. And then step 7, when we step back, step 6 is we'll cover those areas. The material that's needed to bring the site to grade. And I'll talk about what that means. And then after we're all done with the site, we cleaned it all up and we backfilled it for 2 feet. And then more of fill material to get it to grade, we'll request from the DEQ a no further action letter. As I mentioned, you probably can't see this very well. I really can't see it very well. But you've got this map on your lap. There's 8. We've done a lot of work to try to figure out the planning for this project, both in terms of how do we lessen impacts to site workers, how do we lessen impacts to potentially the neighborhood, well, not potentially the neighborhood to the east, how do we lessen impacts of potential cross-contamination, how do we move this material in an efficient way and do it in a way that is most efficient, both cost-effective and makes sense related to what's out there. And we divided this site up into 8 areas, going from east to west across the site. And that's how we're proposing, at least at this point, how the project would go. We're, again, don't have a contract right now with, Sparrow doesn't have a contract right now with the excavation contractor. So things could change a little bit about the sequencing, but the fundamental things in terms of health protection will remain. The way we see this project going is we'll start on the eastern side of the project. First of all, there's 2 roads I want to point out. You see a blue line road, you see a green line road. Both of those roads will be constructed with clean fill material brought on the site and bladed to make a road for trucks to enter. And the reason why is we don't want trucks driving all over the site. We don't want trucks driving here and everywhere and potentially spreading contamination that might be out there. The difference between the roads is that the blue road is a clean fill road. And what that is truck. We're not going to take contaminated material up to the landfill and then load clean material in that site truck and bring it down into the site. We're going to run clean trucks up and down the hill all day long. It makes a lot of sense to that. One, you don't have a cross-contamination issue. The second is just conceptually easier for a truck driver to understand that today you're a clean truck driver, tomorrow maybe you're a dirty truck driver, and it's just easy as a manager for someone trying to manage an excavation like that to keep it all under control. Okay, so the clean road is a road that will only be driven along by clean trucks to bring clean fill material to the property. The dirty road would take dirty material off the property. And the way we envision it happening is, for instance, you'll see in area 1, you'll see on there also excavation depths for those various areas. Area 1, I can't read it, but I believe, since I've looked at it enough times, 2 feet. Area 2 is 2.5 feet. The beginning of the project will be removal of those 2 areas, scraping down, removing it, and then sampling it. Rush the samples, determine what the levels are. Are we good or are we not good? If we're good, then we will begin to backfill the property as we go, and we will backfill it with clean material going down the blue road. Okay? And then we will sequence it all the way across the site from east to west. We'll go to area 3 where we got to excavate 11 feet down, and we'll just simply keep digging our way to the west and stockpiling and bringing soil in behind it on the east, so that we're not bringing clean soil across contaminated soil, and we're systematically moving clean soil in one swoop across the property.
Chris,
Yeah.
would you like a laser pointer?
Sure. Yeah.
Not bad for the stone.
You just carry one around, or? So this is area 2, 3, 4, and the numbers represent how we would proceed. 5, 6, 7, 8 is the last area. Okay. We've got fill material here. The test pit we dug to 18 feet deep in that one test pit. We're going to be digging 18 feet, at least in this area. Here we've got fill material to 10 feet. We're going to be digging to 11 feet. This area was the old log pond. It was backfilled in '98 by Huddig. We're probably going to have to remove some material out of there. We're waiting for compaction results to determine whether we need to. It's not fill material in this area, or if it is fill, it's the upper reaches of that. We probably want to dig all the way down to the bottom of the pond because they removed that material and backfilled it before in this portion of the log pond. Probably hard to see the old log pond, right? That little L. Okay? And this is the old overflow pond, and this is the old drain pond. So it'll sequence across, and in each area we'll get a clearance. Yeah, you can backfill, and we'll just. One thing we played around with is first we thought, well, this is the easiest area to clean. We'll stockpile a bunch of soil here, clean soil. And then we started thinking, it's too close to the neighborhood, and while we'll dust abate it and everything, and have water sprinkling on it, probably not a good idea. I mean, we could get a big wind, 30 mile an hour, and have rooster tails going over the top of that hill, and we don't want to do that. So this area will always be controlled in terms of how much material we brought in. But once we get ahead of it, a couple of weeks, we'll have, for instance, when I show you the sampling, if you look at a half acre, it's like right there. Once we clear that area, we can begin to backfill it and just move across the site. Hope that makes sense. And I'm interested in other, if people have other ideas, that would be, we'd love to hear them. So, as I mentioned, upon acceptable results, below the cleanup standards, we'll do 2 feet of cover over the whole site and then additional clean soil to finish grade. What this map shows is how much additional fill will be on the property when you get it to site grade, you dig all the material out, what we'll have. And I apologize a little bit for the army greens and everything, but anyway, we'll have minimum 2 foot in this area. Minimum, well, 2.5 foot to 4 foot here with an average of 3. 6 to 11 feet of fill material here with an average of 10 feet in this zone. And on and on and on. You got 10 to 13 with an average of 11. I think that says 2 to 10 there. There's a little pocket here where they'll have 2, just a little slice, and the 10 is a little depression down this end. In between, it goes from one to the other, and the average is that. In this pit, you're going to have 19 to 23 feet of clean fill material in that area of the site with an average of 21 feet, and so on and so on. This map just gives you a sense of how much clean fill material will be on the site after everything's excavated and everything meets the standard at that contact before you put the material down. Health protection during cleanup. There's a number of different things that are proposed that are going to go on. One is there'll be a health and safety plan for the site. Not only will Madison Technologies prepare one for their workers, but the contractor, as part of the bid, is required to prepare a health and safety plan for his workers as well. Anyone that comes onto the site, by the way, will need to read that plan and sign it, or they won't be allowed onto the site, including regulatory people. You need to read that and understand what the risks might be. Only HAZWOPER trained personnel in accordance with OSHA will be used on the site. HAZWOPER, I don't know, that's 40-hour OSHA training. out there, hazmat training. Only those people will be used. We're going to control site access. We'll go back a second. Access to the site, there's going to be one entrance to the site, well, two. One for the clean road down here, one for the dirty road over here. You'll see that this little shade is blue, it's clean. And the reason why is that there'll be a we're calling it decon station or a truck wash station. Trucks will not be allowed to leave the site with potentially contaminated material until the outsides of the trucks are completely washed, they are tarped, and then they go up the mountain, or the hill, I should say, to BFI. And that's the only entrance where trucks will come in and out related to material being taken off of the property. Over here, there will be an entrance. This is a road already along here that runs between BFI and the site. There's a road there, and then they'll access in. And again, this will be a clean road. It will be built by us. We will make that road with clean material. So, you know, there's going to be we don't want trucks over here. We don't want the noise. We don't want the dust. We don't want it. We want them to come in over here. Okay? So that's the only place they're going to come in and come out of the site. So we're going to control site access. The entire site will be fenced before we even start excavation with a 6-foot fence. Right now, there's only one fence on the site of this property. It's on the far eastern side along South Street. The boundary between the city is not fenced. The boundary between Clawson is not fenced, and the far western side is not fenced. So any trespasser right now could walk onto that site. When we're doing this work, the site will be fenced. There will be signs on the fence that say restricted area, unauthorized. No one, you have to have authorized access. There'll be dust abatement. I'm sure this is a concern for most, but it's a concern for us, not only in terms of potentially impacting the neighborhood to the east, but it's a concern for us for workers on the site. And we need to dust abate while we're excavating, because we don't want dust to be generated while we're excavating. So there's going to be dust abatement done while we're excavating. There's going to be dust abatement done on the roads, the access roads. There's going to be dust abatement done on the stockpile. We stockpile solar, clean soil. We're still going to dust abate it because we don't want dust blowing around. The other thing is there's going to be related. I lump it into dust abatement. You can call it street sweeping. There's going to be daily street sweeping from, even though we're deconning, we're going to daily street sweep from the site to the landfill every day. Street sweeping up and down that road. It's going to be required by the contractor to do that. Again, trucks will be washed and tarped prior to leaving the site. There'll be a traffic control plan that the contractor has to prepare as part of getting the work, part of the bid spec. There'll be an erosion control plan for local and state regulations, and there'll be limited hours of work for noise and lighting from 7 to 6. Those are the things related to protection during cleanup. Preventing cross-contamination, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be separate trucks for cleaning contaminated soil, each using different roads. Trucks are only allowed on established roads. Dirty trucks are not allowed on clean roads and vice versa. Dust abatement, as I mentioned, will be done on roads, excavation area, the stockpile, and there's the city street sweeping. So those are the things that are going to be in place related to preventing cross-contamination. As I mentioned in the proposed sampling grid, the first one, this is a little different than what's in the plan. The plan showed this map kind of without any relevance to the depths, the log pond being there, and the depths that we need to excavate in the various areas. So this is a new map that has the same grid, half acre. It's actually in some areas a little smaller than half acre. For instance, right in these areas, these are smaller than a half acre. It results in more samples being collected to confirm that we've met cleanup standards there. But it's needed because, as I said, this site is really broken up into areas, manageable areas. And we didn't want a half acre like straddling halfway into our 11-foot deep pit and halfway into an area digging 2 or 3 feet down. It makes it more burdensome to try to establish that cleanup goal. So what we've done is we've taken those areas and broke them out into half-foot grids. And that's what this map shows. And It's really not a whole lot different. Again, all it does is it increases a few more samples. I think it goes from 41 to 49 samples on the site, so it increases by 8. How many samples have we collected? As far as those samples are collected, the proposal in the plan is to take each one of those half-acre creeks that I showed you and break it into essentially 8 equal areas and collect 2 samples randomly from each one of those areas, survey those points. This site's going to have heavy-duty surveying because couple different reasons. One, the contractor is going to be paid by how much he removes from the site, how many yards, by the survey before and the survey after. Okay, so we have to have accurate surveying of the whole site when we're done in terms of the entire property to accurately calculate how many yards of material did we take off the property in order to compensate the contractor. The site is, as I mentioned, is divided into those 8 areas. We'll collect those samples. We'll collect 2 in each area. 1 in each area will be combined with the others and run as a composite for both penta and dioxin. The other will be archived in the event that this whole area does not pass, for a better word. And we might want to say, well, which one of these little squares contributed to that failure? We could run all those samples. The cost to do that is pretty high because the dioxin analysis on a rush turnaround is about $1,000 each. So if we chose that route, we'd have to spend $8,000 just to get the results, get them in a week. It's more likely we'll dig a little deeper and try to get down and make sure that we've got the base meeting those standards. Laboratory splits and field duplicates and field equipment claims will be collected in accordance with EPA guidance. It's fairly established how many you have to take, when you have to take them. DQ has the right and is welcome to come out and take a duplicate sample. I'm sure they will during the process of the project. Preventing future exposure. How do we prevent future exposure, I guess, after the project is there? Well, one is, remember, we're cleaning to residential standards before we put any fill material on the property. That is, the soil that's down below where people are not standing on the site meets residential standards. And those depths vary from, as I showed you, anywhere from 2 to 23 feet down. So there's going to be a minimum of 2 feet of clean soil over the site. I don't have an average for you, but it's considerably higher than 2 feet. There'll be private utility service trenches will be backfilled with clean material. And what that means is that when we, on a private person's property, when we're laying the water line and the sewer line, clean material will be brought in to backfill that line. And the reason being is if they need to fix that line, or if someone does without a permit, which believe it or not happens in the sea, they would dig down and be digging in clean material. They wouldn't be digging in material that potentially might meet the standard or not meet the standard. Okay? I mean, we are going to clean it to the standard, but I'm never going to tell you that I'm going to know every inch of that property in terms of what might be there. So that's a protection level for future exposure. Exposure barriers to native soils will be installed in crawl spaces, and I got a figure up here I'll show you in a minute. There will be a visible membrane placed between native soil and clean soil on single-family lots. This is a big deal. We thought about it, but we thought this kind of gave people the sense that maybe the stuff dirty below there, we didn't clean it to the standard. We finally just decided, let's be a little bit more protective than we need to do on those single-family lots where maybe they have 4 feet of clean material, and again, they get a permit and they do something they shouldn't do. There's going to be there's going to be this membrane that they hit. What the heck is this? And it might make them think, hey, I should call somebody. I don't know what that is. So that's going to be placed on the single-family lots. And the southern boundary of the property will be fenced. That's to keep people, kids and everything from wandering maybe down to the city's property, which has not been cleaned up yet. It also is, that fence can be slatted if we're concerned about maybe, dust blowing off that property. Although it's vegetated right now, it can be slatted. So there will be a fence on the southern boundary of the development. As I mentioned before, in terms of the foundation details, how some protection will be done in the future is that in crawl spaces, We're building, this is just a diagram trying to show you what the footings of a typical structure might look like. Gives you an idea of how these footings would be, all the material around them would be clean imported soil. Seems cool when you like this. And then in this area, because some people have hatches to get into the crawl spaces, they put skis down there or whatever. Maybe they have a root cellar, I don't know. But some people have a crawl space that's not very deep. I don't get it in because I have to. But there will be a barrier here between this native soil. There'll be a PVC ground cover barrier there, and then there'll be clean wash gravel 6 inches on top of that. So if somebody goes down in there, they're not in contact with the native soil down below. The only difference is if basements are built in this case, this would be a slab. Instead of clean wash gravel and a liner, this would be all one slab for the basement floor. Okay, that's the only difference. You know, this would be higher, obviously, but it's the same concept. There's no contact with material down below. In a single family dwelling, there would be that barrier. Remember that barrier I talked about? Or not barrier, but that little membrane would be right here. Right along this whole thing. So this could be double membrane again. Although that membrane there is just for marking purposes, not for potential, it's not a sealed membrane that I'm talking about for a single family lot. Cleanup oversight. First of all, cleanup and verification, as I mentioned, cleanup and verifications will be completed in phases by sub-area, sub-area to sub-area, sub-area to sub-area. And along the way, we'll need clearance from the DEQ to begin to backfill any of those areas. So it's not like we're going to clean it all up, send all our samples in and wait. We're going to move as we go. There'll be weekly regulatory agency updates of work progress. If the DEQ wants to be on the site, that would be great to have those meetings at the site. If not, they'll be done conference call or probably sometimes in Helena. There'll be quality control assurance sampling, as I mentioned, and regulatory personnel may visit the site anytime, provided they sign the health and safety plan, and you know they read that, sign it, and meet hopefully in the morning so they can go over the safety meeting, the daily safety meeting. So in summary, I'm going to try to summarize this. I hope I haven't bored you too bad. We're going to remove soil above residential cleanup standards, which are 30 parts per trillion for dioxin, 185 parts per billion for chemicals. We're going to do confirmation samples over the entire site. I showed you those grids. There's going to be at least 2 feet of clean cover over the entire site after we establish that we've met cleanup goals to residential levels. And it's going to be considerably deeper in most of the property. Dust abatement will be completed throughout the project. Streets will be swept daily. The entire site will be fenced and access controlled. Site access will be on Rogers Street only. Trucks will be washed and tarped prior to leaving the site. Traffic control will be done according to city regulations. Again, those weekly regulatory updates. And there'll be a fence on the south end of the south side. With that, I'm here to, I guess we're going to go to a question and answer session. Do you want me to move this? Or do you just want to pass that microphone around to people that may have a question?
I think we'll move that back and put the microphone on that stand.
Yeah. And everybody state their name before they start speaking.
And you may have to spell your name also, if that's...
Testing? All right. When people come up, it would help our court recorder if you let her see your face as you're speaking so that she can make sure she gets your words correctly also.
I'd like to remind folks, I'm sorry, Alex. I'd like to remind folks, let's limit our questions to 2 per question before allowing someone else to speak. And please make this a question and answer forum. We'll have time for statements afterwards. Did you want to?
Could My name is Alexandra Gorman, Gorman. Do you need an address or anything?
We have a sign-in sheet, Alex. We'll get you.
Great. Okay. Well, the first question I have, and I want to thank Chris for a good presentation. There was a lot of information in the presentation that I haven't seen before. I'm sort of a geek about reading reports fairly thoroughly that get submitted to people like the DEQ. So I've actually read every word of this, and it's called a final draft. But there's a whole lot of information that was presented tonight about the clean road and the dirty road and the various health and safety things that were not in here. And my concern is, I understand that, Maxim is saying they're going to do these things, but is DEQ signing off on the fact that they're doing these things? Because if it's not in here and you're signing off on this plan, how do we know those things are going to get done?
That's a good question, Alex. And I believe that the intent is for Maxim to address those concerns in a bid spec form, if I'm not mistaken, Chris, some of those concerns. And that's something that we will review, and that's what we would put our final stamp on as far as a work plan goes. So you're correct. Some of these maps and things aren't found in the proposal that was for review, but they will be part of a proposal that DEQ would finalize.
And will there be public comment on that part?
No.
Okay. Just a little concerned about how much that changes between now and then.
Right.
But okay. And I guess my second question involves the one thing that you didn't mention in terms of health and safety on the site, and unless this is in the health and safety plan, which we haven't seen, it says in the report that there's a claim that previous dioxin sampling on the site hasn't found levels higher than 2,000 parts per trillion, which is the construction worker safety level, and therefore you won't require personal protection equipment for construction workers on site, and no monitoring is required. My question comes from the fact that there was a sample on site that found 3,500 parts per trillion, and 5 feet of it was something was taken away, but no further sampling was done around the site to determine whether or not that 3,000 parts per trillion is anywhere else on the site, or even beyond the 5 feet. So how do you justify not requiring the personal protection equipment when it seems like there may well be dioxin higher than 2,000?
Two things. I think the plan doesn't say that I think the plan says that existing soil on the site, based on the sampling that's been done, doesn't show a level over 2,000 feet, which is a little different than what you said.
Okay.
The area that you're talking about that had above 2,000, how they had dug that area out and resampled and showed it to be much lower.
1 foot down.
Yeah. The key, though, I think, is the health and safety plan may require protection, personal protection, particularly maybe for the excavator. The key is going to be dust abatement on this project. The key is that if there's a lot of dust being generated and there's any potential for that to be volatile and people breathing it, then they may be exposed to it. Now, every other sample, other than that one sample you're talking about across the site, shows levels considerably below 2,000. So there's been about, between the city's property and this site, there's probably been about 20 to 25 dioxin samples, and one of them had a level of that on the far western side. There also is, and Brian Douglas is here to talk a little bit about it, that sample came apparently close to a potential source that's different than the rest of the site. But I think, Alex, the key is going to be dust abatement. Without doing dust abatement, you potentially increase that risk. And I think with doing dust abatement, you have the ability to be in gloves. You're still going to have gloves. You're still going to have Tyvek. You're still going to have things to protect yourself, but you're not going to be in respiratory protection. Now, that hasn't been finalized, but
Right.
We'll have to look.
And there's not going to be any air monitoring to make sure there's no dust.
And that, I believe that was in their plan to specifically address that one portion, that extra excavation would be taking place at that site around that individual sample because confirmation sample wasn't conducted after the initial investigation a number of years ago. So that specific area would be addressed further.
Great. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mike Barton. I'm with the Office of Planning and Grants. Barton, B-A-R-T-O-N. And I should admit right up front that I have an interest in this from the development side. Our office has been heavily involved with the plan for what would eventually occur at the site, which we hope will be residential development. But I have two, I think, fundamental questions about the situation at the site right now. And the first one is, does the site as it exists pose a risk to the neighborhood and surrounding community? We've talked about dust abatement, and I assume that the site, without any treatment or remediation, continues to be a hazard for the community.
Actually, the baseline risk assessment established that a trespasser scenario did not present an elevated risk to folks, and that's presently why the site is not fenced and remains in the condition it remains in.
Okay, so it doesn't pose any danger if we leave it as is.
Correct.
I mean, I
as a
realize that we don't.
trespasser scenario. I mean,
right.
Right. With no excavation taking place and no disturbances per se, then correct.
So it's okay to leave it alone.
Let me maybe step in here. I'm sorry, I'm Denise Martin. I'm with DEQ. And I know Andy was focusing on trespassers, but what our risk assessment also demonstrates is that cleanup needs to occur at the facility for residential or commercial use. We have cleanup levels that are protective of groundwater, and it is not appropriate to let the site remain as is. But as far as people walking across the facility, a trespasser type of scenario for short term, that does not present an unacceptable risk.
Okay, and I guess bottom line, what I'm getting at with that question is it a good thing to do something at the site? And you would indicate yes. And Andy, maybe you would indicate, well, it's kind of neutral. The second question is this, and again, this is something
that wouldn't be what I'd indicate.
Okay,
I'd indicate that something has to
I don't
take
want to
place at the
characterize you.
facility.
The second question has to do with our involvement from the get-go, and one thing that our office has insisted on as far as economic support of the eventual development was that the site would have to be cleaned up to residential standard. My question, though, is this. If the site cannot achieve the level that DEQ would recognize as safe for residential development, what happens to the site?
I believe the site that cleanup goal can be achieved.
I understand that, but I mean, I think a lot of concern in the community is that it may not be achievable, and it's been it's been an underlying concern of my office from the get-go. So, hypothetically, if as much as you excavate, you can't achieve a residential standard, and this question may be more for Tim than anybody else, but if you cannot achieve a safe level for residential development, what happens to the site? Also keeping in mind that the city at that point has a significant financial interest in the site.
Let me try to answer your question first. Again, I'm Denise Martin with DEQ. I would like to really assure people here that we are going to be looking closely at the confirmation sample results that come back from this facility. And DEQ will not issue a no further action determination if residential cleanup levels are not met. And I mean, I am relying on my technical expert, and there are certainly other technical experts that have given their input that they believe that these cleanup levels can be achieved. But if they are not, DEQ will not be saying that this site would be acceptable for residential use. and I can't answer your question about money that the city may have invested. Could I interject here really quickly? I had a question for Chris that I hoped he could answer, and I didn't get in there quick enough. There is new information, and I wanted to better understand your clean road. Could we, well, you already took your presentation down, but you were talking about approaching cleanup from grid number or area number 1 and number 2 first. And I'm not quite getting how the trucks get from this road into this area. I'm not quite understanding. Are you telling me all of area 1 and area 2 will have all the contaminated soil excavated from it before, and confirmation samples that come back clean before you try to haul in clean fill?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you. That was my question. I'm sorry.
I'm Gail Gucci, and I represent House District 66, in which White Pine Sash resides. And Gucci, G-U-T-S-C-H-E. My first question is, although I understand that it's allowed under administrative rule that you can go with an interim action, I'm wondering why DEQ is not going with the full remedial plan, and what the differences might be between those two plans, both in terms of any differences in cleanup or other requirements and public process. That's my first question.
Under the SECRA process, really a public meeting is the only order or, I'm sorry, it's the only thing not required, as opposed to a voluntary cleanup plan or something along that line for the SECRA process. We're the only thing we're not, that isn't required during an interim action is a public meeting, which is what we agreed with Sparrow Group to hold to address those concerns. But as far as some process that is different than any other, than a voluntary cleanup or any other, I don't know how, I'm a bit...
Representative Gucci, let me try to address that question, and I can appreciate perhaps the concern. Let me give a little bit of history for those of you who haven't followed this site with your hearts all these years. It's been around for a long time, and I know a lot of you in the audience have followed it closely. So for those of you who might not be as familiar, DEQ has been working with HUDIC to investigate this facility. HUDIC has undertaken some interim actions in the past. This process has been a long, slow process that we have heard from the community and others, a desire to try to proceed with cleanup, albeit even if it's limited, and that we have clean property that can be developed. That currently, as the property sits as a vacant field without any development occurring, people really got to be concerned. We are in our state Superfund process at the point where HUDIC is getting ready to submit its draft feasibility study to the department. We'll be reviewing that. We'll be providing comment to HUDIC, asking for any necessary changes that we think need to be made, and then we'll be putting that document out along with what DEQ believes is the appropriate final cleanup for the site to the public for their input. So the reason we're not waiting for that is truly a timing issue. We have had a third party come to DEQ proposing to do cleanup here. We don't normally have that happen, to be quite honest. Most of the time, we have to drag people kicking and screaming to get them to clean up sites. This is an opportunity that for a lot of reasons has come to fruition so far, and timing is critical. And so from our perspective, we have the ability to entertain any interim action that HUDIC or anyone else might propose. So it's not, we at DEQ are looking at this interim action as really being the final action for that portion of the facility. And because we are looking at it that way, we need to make sure that it meets all the other requirements under SECRA that the HUDIC, the cleanup that HUDIC is going to have to do will have to meet. Okay?
And then my second question is, what about the southern portion of the property? I know that's not addressed in this plan. I know that's not what this plan is about. But how will cleanup there impact what perhaps gets done on the part where we're going to build the housing? When will that be required to happen? Will that have to be to residential standards? Okay.
That's a very good question. In fact, since we are dealing with a facility that is in a residential neighborhood, there are a number of options or a number of ways we would be remediating the southern portion of the facility or the city's portion of the facility, regardless of what has happened up in the northern portion of the facility. It's basically another residential, if the houses are in or if the construction is taking place, we also have a community right across the street. And those protective measures for cleaning up the southern portion of the facility are going to be required regardless. It just adds more, we're adding more community to an area, like I said, that already has a community right across the street. So things like dust abatement, traffic control will all be concerns when addressing the southern portion of the facility. You asked about timing. Right now we're finishing up the feasibility portion of the SECRA process where we evaluate all the alternatives for cleaning up the entire site. Different cleanup goals have been set for the southern portion of the facility because of the contamination, because the treatment process took place there. So when you ask about residential cleanup goals and things like that, they differ in that for PCP, for example, it's 2 parts per billion rather than 185 because we're looking at migration to groundwater. So
when will the southern part be cleaned up or be required to be cleaned up?
I think we have the feasibility study first draft coming at the end of next month or the beginning of next month. I have to look at my plan. And after that is reviewed by DEQ, a proposed plan will be submitted this summer, and then a ROD will be issued shortly after. So I envision...
Ideally, we would get our record of decision issued by the end of this year, assuming all the information is available in the feasibility study that we need to have. We'll get public comment on that. We'll consider those comments. We'll respond. We'll issue a record of decision. What we need to also have is a legal mechanism in place requiring HUDIC to undertake those cleanup actions. And so typically what happens is we try to negotiate an agreement. We normally give 90 days to negotiate an agreement. If we're unable to do that, we have some other legal options available. The department could order HUDIC to undertake the cleanup. They may challenge that, and we might have a longer process than normal. So in the best of worlds, in the best of cooperation, if we get a legal agreement in place, it's possible that by the end of next summer, some type of work could begin. But that's assuming all goes well, that there aren't data gaps that still need to be filled, that we're able to reach agreement with HUDIC for implementing the final cleanup.
Hi, my name is John Couch, C-O-U-C-H. I'm a resident of the West Side. My first question has to do with the removal of the material on the site. And having worked almost 30 years in the lumber products, timber industry, and at different sawmills and whatnot, I know that we're not always really conscious or concerned about where we dump and bury things. So I'm looking at this old site here and I'm thinking, okay, you're going to be out there, you're going to have men out there in machines, you're going to be scraping off this material at different depths. You've pinpointed certain areas where you've done this testing. Some have come up hot, some have not, some less. What happens if these guys are out there scraping off this material and all of a sudden they uncover something? It's not one of the spots that's been designated, this is a hot spot or anything like this. It's got a smell to it, it's got a coloration to it, or something like that. Who's there to watch these guys? Who's there? I mean, how long are they? Who's going to be standing there all this time while they're digging this up? And what's to say that this guy operating the front loader is just going to say, "Whoa, let's get this out of here," before somebody sees it. So that's kind of a concern right there, and that's my first question. Where's the oversight on this, and who's watching these guys dig this up?
There would be a project supervisor that Chris indicated to me would be hired for overseeing the construction on a daily basis. My intent is to oversee, as from a regulatory standpoint, where confirmation sampling, critical junctures of the project take place. I will be involved. But you're right, on a daily basis, there needs to be someone there, and I believe that's addressed in the health and safety plan, that a cleanup officer or a site officer is there responsible for the work on a daily basis. I don't know if Chris wants to expound on that further, but
John, there's going to be, there on the Maxim side, there will be obviously someone there for Maxim during the whole project. In fact, there will be, during the excavation portion of the project and sampling, there will be a person there from Maxim, and there will also be a person, probably more than one, or at least one, related to the backfilling and compaction that will be needed to demonstrate that it's compacted enough in order to get, in order to build upon it. Because that's a big component of this project, is making sure that what's put back in is suitable for building. So there will be a Maxim scientist there the whole time. I will be actively involved in it as well. I can't say I'll be on site the whole time, but I will be out there quite a bit. And I personally can tell you that if we find, going into any cleanup of this magnitude on a site like a wood products site, are we going to find some unknowns? Certainly we may. It's possible. It's a big site. It's been there for a long time. But we have no intentions to hide things if we find something. If we find something that's there that needs to come out, then because it's there and it might be a pollution problem, then we're going to take it out and sample to verify that it's been taken out. Our goal is to, meet those residential standards.
and requiring that workers meet that 40-hour OSHA training, they're able to recognize a hazard or a problem, and for their own safety, I'm sure they would speak up and address that problem. They're able to recognize that. That's part of the training that's going to be required for people that are on the site.
I might like to interject also that while Andy indicated that he plans to be on site during key activities, that the way we've handled oversight at other projects entails a number of planned visits and then also a number of unannounced visits to the site, so that even though Andy may call Chris for planned visits, Andy will also periodically do unannounced visits to check on the progress of the work, to make sure that the work plan is being adhered to, and to be there to observe anything that seems unusual. And the other thing I would say is, in my experience at DEQ, we've received a fair number of complaints from construction workers. They're working on projects that give us a call and say, hey, I don't think this was right. My supervisor was telling me not to worry about this barrel that I found while I was working on the site. And so, quite honestly, there sort of is some self-policing actually that goes on during these activities. And it's a site of this, a project of this size is going to have a lot of eyes looking at it, not just from a regulatory perspective, but the people that are on the ground doing the work.
One other thing I want to mention about that, John, is that there also are people that are involved that have licenses and putting licenses on the line, both professional engineers, registered geologists that have to certify things as we go along in this process. And I don't know, certainly the people I work with would risk their license over a potential problem that might be there.
Thank you. I think I hit a nerve there. My second question. Let's say that we do get a no further action sign-off on this particular development, that's good. What I'm wondering is, because this site is now no further action on this site, but the site is still surrounded by contaminated site, and some things that I looked at your map, like I'm looking at the northern portion, it says sawmill or sawdust pile, and I noticed that sawdust pile was in like a half a pie shape. I've never seen a sawdust pile that shape, so I'm wondering, okay, well, it must have been round, it had to go into this property line boundary. But whatever, we've got the sign off, we've got the no further action, and what I'm wondering is, for the people that are going to be living in this community on this site, is there going to be any kind of follow through as far as their health goes? Who's going to be tracking that? Is it going to be a baseline set? We've got these people that are now surrounded almost completely by still more Superfund site. Are we going to be watching them as they're living there? And how, is there any kind of plan in place for that?
Earlier.
I'll try to answer your question. When we clean up Superfund sites and we achieve the appropriate cleanup level, if it's for residential and we achieve residential, we do not go back and revisit. Those numbers are meant to be protective. They are not meant to be levels where people should be seeing health effects. When we do our risk assessment, we are looking at contaminant concentrations and what levels are problematic and potentially pose health effects for folks. So there's really no process in place at this site or any other Superfund site where we go back once the cleanup is complete and do some subsequent monitoring to look at people's health. What there is available in the state of Montana, not through the Department of Environmental Quality, but through our Department of Public Health and Human Services, is a program that looks at cancer clusters and also looks at other potential health effect problems that are brought to the agency's attention through various doctors in the area. And so while there's no program in place from a Superfund perspective, because we've already met cleanup levels that we believe are protective, there is another agency within the state that would be monitoring any problems that doctors or health officials, hospitals begin to see as a reoccurring problem. And then there are ways to look at that and try to get a better handle on it.
Thank you.
Okay.
My name is David Ponder, P-O-N-D-E-R. I'm the director of Montana PIRG, the Montana Public Interest Research Group. I've got a couple of questions. My first question is about where the soil is going to be removed to. In the final draft plan, it says that the soil is going to be removed to the landfill. What portion of the landfill is that going to be removed to, and is there going to be any protection or treatment of the soil before it's deposited in the landfill? Is the landfill going to be lined or anything like that?
There won't be treatment in the landfill other than blading the soil over the material will be put on a lined cell of the landfill. So there will be a liner underneath the material. But there won't be any physical treatment other than mixing it with other soil and using it for daily cover and blending and over the property.
Okay. My Second question is about the sampling and the using the composite sampling. You use this risk-based baseline in the sampling in the composite. So my understanding is that you sample, take one sample from each of the 8 cells, and then basically put it in a bowl and mix it up and test it and see if it rises above that baseline. How do you justify using that baseline when you have potentially a diluted sample?
I think it's important to realize that this is a process that's used in all Superfund sites to establish cleanup levels and remediation. When you're looking at compositing sampling, you're trying to address a target area. And yes, there are possibilities that some samples may be above or below your PRG or your remediation goal, but you have to look at the size of the area that you're willing to accept as an acceptable exposure area. And that's what we use at every Superfund site in the state to achieve those goals. It's not feasible, given testing and costs and things like that, to test 2 foot by 2 foot squares or something like that. You need to address, find an area that you find acceptable to address those exposure routes and exposure area.
Thanks.
I'm Dennis Daneke, D-A-N-E-K-E, with the Carpenters Union. My questions are more practical. The boundary that's on your map is nice on paper, but when we dig in Montana, everything tips to slough. I was wondering if you had a treatment plan for the property boundary. Are you going to shore it or dig back into adjacent properties?
On areas, we're not anticipating significant slough on areas where we're digging 2 to 3, even 4 feet deep, but we are anticipating significant slough where we're digging, for instance, in the log pond area along Clausen's property, and we will be removing some of Clausen's soil. We're going to maintain a 1-to-1 slope up that hill, so that material will be taken off and hauled away as well.
Okay, thank you. And one more question. Many people in this community are day sleepers. I was one for many years, and I was wondering if you had a contingency plan in case one lives across the street.
I can certainly give you my cell phone number and my number, and there will be a shack out there that you could call. I mean, it gets to what is the best time to do the work.
Well, absolutely, but
Right.
if there were some alternative rest place for someone,
Right.
that would be something to consider.
Okay.
My name is Tony Tweedale. It's spelled T-W-E-E-D-A-L-E. My 2 questions are for DEQ. In general, I'm wondering what the plans are for long-term oversight or permanent oversight of this portion of the physical site, either monitoring or assignation of liability. The parties have documented how the groundwater in this area of the valley doesn't flow predictably like it does in the open part of the valley. And it seems to me with the incredibly heavy contamination in the southern part of the site, and nobody apparently knows, and I stand to be corrected, just how much contaminated penta went underneath the Scott Street abutments, concrete abutments, which will never be remediated, as far as I know. It seems to me that there's potential for, in the future, once the housing has been built, for contamination to make its way back due to these funny groundwater flows. These funny groundwater flows. make its way to the housing. There's also the issue of co-solvency. The dioxins, which drive the risk, are dissolved into groundwater by the penta. In other words, the penta is partly water soluble and partly fat soluble, grabs onto the dioxin, which is fat soluble, and just like detergents do, dissolves it into the groundwater. So when you also consider that some of the prevalent dioxins in penta, the hexachlorodioxins, are some of the few dioxins whose cancer potency has been studied other than 2378 TCDD dioxin, and that cancer assay showed that those dioxins that we're dealing with here are very potent carcinogens and whose other toxicities are completely unstudied. When you add all this up, it seems to me that in the long term, DEQ needs to more assurances of how its release of liability of the responsible parties occurs. I was wondering if there's any possibility of a conditional release from liability in perpetuity that would could tie in with continued monitoring at the site over the long term. I'm a little concerned about the PVC membrane underneath the houses. PVC, soft PVC, is a plastic that's well known to degrade over time. It releases its own toxins, chlorinated toxins, of course. A lot of the plasticizers, which don't bind to the polymer, help degrade the PVC. So that would potentially be a route of exposure to people in this housing. I think I'll shut up there.
Okay, I think I am the one who's been designated to answer your question about a conditional release in terms of the no further action determination. When DEQ issues a no further action determination, they're always conditional. They're always conditional on if DEQ receives new or different information other than that we had at the time we made our closure decision. We reserve the right to reopen a site, for example. So there's no such thing as an absolute release from the department when you're talking about secret liability. That no further action determination, assuming that Sparrow or Huttig were to get one, will always be conditional.
Okay.
I'd also like to add that you had, I think, more than one question in there. I think.
A lot of statements.
But there was something that I did want to touch on a little bit. And I think you were getting at the liability issue and what if we find out groundwater flow directions change due to something in the future. And I think Cindy addressed that. But you also raised a concern about the PVC liner that a Sparrow Group is proposing to incorporate into its development. And I just need to let folks know that from DEQ's perspective, we don't believe that PVC liner or PVC cover material is necessary because we believe that the contamination is going to be excavated. We will ensure it meets site cleanup levels, and those cleanup levels will be for residential use, and therefore DEQ is not requiring or would not require the PVC material to be incorporated into the development. The developer, if he chooses to do some additional things outside of that, is up to him.
My other question for DEQ, I wonder if there are any plans to protect against the conflicts of interest of some of the contractors at this site. Some people who have been involved in the investigation of the site, and I'm not talking about DEQ here, are also financially involved with the real estate development of this site. And in my mind, that sets up, I guess massive is the right adjective, conflict of interest that could impact their conclusions, which DEQ is, of course, heavily relying on. And I'm not in any way, suggesting that parties with conflicts of interest are automatically reach bad conclusions. For example, the editor of the British Medical Journal, when that journal changed its conflict of interest policy to probably the strongest conflict of interest policy of any scientific journal, made a statement to the effect that none of us are blessed with knowledge of what drives our thought processes, and that biases are subtle and hard to figure out. So because it seems to me that there is a severe financial conflict of interest with this project, I'd like to hear something about what DEQ's plans are to minimize the impact of it, of any potential bias.
Let me try to address that, and I think I understand where your concern is coming from. And Chris is, I think, a little concerned, but let me just say that I don't think Tony is implying in anything that you have done. Maybe I misunderstood you, but I don't think he's making any statement here that you might have done something incorrect in your work on this particular project. In general, I think what your concern is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that at all of these Superfund sites, DEQ requires the responsible party to do the work. And in this particular case, we have a third party doing the work. But that those people go out and hire their own consultants to do investigation and cleanup on these particular pieces of property, and that perhaps there is some interest in minimizing cost for the client and those types of things. DEQ's role, and one of the things we look at very strongly in these types of cleanups, is our oversight role, our role in being in the field with our own eyes and ears, seeing what's happening, making sure that work plans are being followed. And we also have the ability even to double check the laboratories that are being used, so that when someone goes out and collects samples, DEQ has the option to also collect the same sample, submit it to a different laboratory, and see how comparable our results are. And those are some of the steps that we take to provide some assurance that the work is occurring according to the plan, that people aren't trying to sidestep things. So I hope I understood your question.
You're right. You interpreted me correctly. It's just a general concern of mine. I have no specific concerns on this issue.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
May I comment on that? I'm Tim Gurman with Sparrow Group. In this case, you have an additional layer of checking because we're not relying on HUDIC's information that they provide for DEQ. We hired our own consultant, Maxim, to do the investigation and to write a cleanup plan and report for us to meet the cleanup conditions. So there is no conflict of interest on our part at all.
Thank you.
I have a couple of additional questions. My name again is David Ponder, P-O-N-D-E-R, with Montana PIRG, P-I-R-G. Tony's question raises the very question, will DEQ do its own sampling for the cleanup of this site?
When confirmation samples are taken, a representative from DEQ will be on site, more than likely myself, and split samples will be part of the sampling procedure. DEQ will not take a sample, a subsample of each confirmation sample throughout the facility, but enough samples to be representative that good science is prevailing and that the correct sampling protocol is being conducted.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, and that is in regards to the Asheville area in the, I guess it's the southwest corner of the site. And people in the audience can follow along with their maps. On the first figure, there's a greater than 3.3 parts per million sample for PCP just on the southern side of the boundary. And from looking at the map, it looks like that disposal pit crosses that southern and northern portion of the boundary. My math tells me that's greater than the 185 parts per trillion sample that you want to get to on the northern side of the boundary. Now, the excavation depth there is estimated to be a foot and a half. Now, I think my recollection from looking at the final draft plan is that the depth of that fill area is more than that. And I was wondering, and this goes back to Alex's question earlier, if this is going to be excavated to a further depth, will that be reflected in the final plan? And will there be an opportunity for comment on that?
Right. One thing I think that's important to understand is that Maxim's proposal does not include the former ash pit as far as investigation goes. Huddig Building Products is responsible for the investigation and subsequent samples and results from the ash pit and the total investigation of that area. Samples have been collected within the past week to classify that area to get an idea on size and depth, and they'll be the responsible party that DEQ looks to provide classification in that portion of the property.
So let me make sure I understand your response correctly. Sparrow Group and Maxim or whoever's putting this forward, if it's found that there's a problem, there won't be required to do that as part of this remediation plan, and that'll be the responsibility of Huddig. And when would that take place?
Let me try to answer a couple of questions because there was something else you brought up earlier that I would like to talk about briefly. First off, the less than 3.3 parts per million sample result. That was a sample that was collected using an analytical method that would not let us get down to the parts per billion level. It's an older method. There are better methods that we are using today. So I guess what I want to caution is just because it says less than 3.3, sampling it using current methods might reveal that it is also less than 185 parts per billion. So that's one of the reasons why additional sampling was needed from the ash pit area, and Huddig has been doing that work. What we understand, based on our current review of the proposal, and we are still looking at it, just please bear that in mind. We certainly don't know that we have all of our questions addressed yet. But it's my understanding that it is an area that Sparrow Group agreed to having surveyed out, and that it would be clearly delineated so that DEQ's no further action determination, if it were to be issued, would only apply to the areas that had been cleaned, had met residential cleanup levels. And that would mean that Huddig would have to go back and potentially address the ash pit. And that would happen most likely when we issue our record of decision for the site, assuming we cooperate and reach a legal agreement to get the final cleanup done, potentially as early as late summer of next year.
Great. If I can just ask a really quick follow-up to that. So assume that you do have to sort of survey that section out. Will you require the fencing and that sort of thing that you'll require along the southern boundary as well?
If the sample results come back and indicate that there are contaminants present in the ash that would be problematic for trespasser scenario, then that would be something that we would require. But it's my understanding from listening to the presentation tonight, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you had a plan to fence the area. Did I misunderstand that in your presentation, Chris?
The southern boundary would be fenced. If the area is deemed out of the cleanup, then that area would be fenced off. The other thing to realize is that the redevelopment part of it, in terms of what has, and it's going to be done in phases in terms of how the property is constructed. It's going to start on the eastern side. It's not anticipated to have development on the western side probably, till 5 years from now. So there will be time for HUDIG to address that area and clean it up.
Great. Thank you.
My name is Bob Oakes, O-A-K-S, and my address is 1026 Kennett Street. I have a question about the playing field that I think kind of relates to that last question. As I understand it now, the playing field is not going to be cleaned up except maybe in a small portion where there is kind of an overflow of a spot that needs to be cleaned up from the development site. And if that's the case, is it going to again be HUDIC's responsibility to clean up the rest of the playing field? This is a whole bunch of questions, but they're all related. Or is there going to be no necessary cleanup required for the playing field, or do you even know those?
At this time, Bob, that's not part of the proposal, and that being still on this Missoula city property, that would have to be dealt with under a separate plan.
I guess that's a question I need to ask the mayor then eventually.
Right now, that property that I think you're talking about on the eastern portion of the site that lies on the city property is not part of this proposal.
The southeast corner.
Right.
But I thought that there was some...
There was some talk of that, but at this time, that's not part of the proposal.
Okay.
If it would become, it would be addressed right now by the city, or since the city owns that portion of the property, if they have a work plan to submit to address that.
It would be obviously be a really beneficial thing to kind of coordinate all the parties to get that done at the same time, if it's at all possible. And I have one more question, and that has to do with a traffic safety plan for the trucks. And I'm sure you have one, but is there a consideration that children are in the neighborhood too, and that the drivers will have to keep a special eye out for them who won't be as aware as some of the pedestrians, adult pedestrians? Thanks.
Peter Nielsen, City County Health Department. Couple of questions, but first I want to thank Tim, Chris, and DEQ for responding positively to many of the comments that we've given you and improving the plan substantially in our view. I agree, Chris, that one of the big concerns is dust abatement and dust control. We know that because anytime any small-scale movement of dirt occurs out there, our phone rings with complaints from neighbors at the health department. The plan does not include any significant detail in how the dust abatement would be accomplished and what elements of the plan there would be available for the public to see. Can you elaborate more now tonight on that dust control plan, and would you agree to including some detail on that in the plan so that our department and neighbors are assured that they'll be protected from airborne dust emissions from the project?
Sure. This deals with a general question that there's a lot more information that was presented tonight that was not in the plan, and I appreciate those comments. Part of that has to do with the speed at which we're under trying to move forward on this project and come up with an appropriate plan to clean it up. And one of those things is dust abatement. Maxim, and I'm going to speak for Sparrow here, has no problem with modifying the plan to include a number of different things and issues that have been brought up today. We've indicated to the DEQ we're more than willing to attach the bid spec to the document as an appendix. I'm more than willing to write certain sections that address dust abatement, traffic control, all those things. It's specific to dust abatement. The way we envision it doing is that the roads would be watered consistently throughout the day. The excavation face would be watered with a hose to keep the dust down while the excavation is going on. The street would be swept on a daily basis, and the whole property will be watered as we're doing the project, so that we don't have any areas of the site producing, dust in any significant amount. And I'd certainly be more than willing to spell that out for you people, for people to look at, to see how we're going to do it.
That would be great. I appreciate that, and I think it would be important to do that in the plan and not just in documents that are bid spec documents later on with DEQ.
Sure.
And we would, of course, appreciate being able to see those as
Right.
well.
And it's certainly unusual to have a bid spec in a document, and the bid spec might not even answer all those questions. So I see a need in the final plan to have some sections that address all those issues.
John Harvala, City County Health Department. Harvala, Harvala. Just a narrower question. What are you going to define as contaminated material? I mean, I know in the initial plan, or the plan we were reviewing, there's areas delineated where concentrations were above the remediation goals. Are you going to essentially define all material removed from the site to be contaminated and such subject to decon and truck wash procedures?
Yeah. Am I on? Yeah. Every load that leaves the property with material the truck will be washed and the truck will be tarped. Every single load.
Okay.
So everything that's hauled off the property, the whole 116 or 120,000 yards would be tarped and hauled off.
Okay, great.
Gail Goodshee. I guess it's sort of a follow-up to that. It's kind of been asked already tonight, but still trying to get at this. If the material that's removed, is it considered a hazardous waste? The penta and dioxin contaminated material, is that considered hazardous waste?
The department made a determination, I can't even remember how many years ago now. It's been probably 2 or 3, well, probably closer to 3, maybe 4, in working with HUDIC, that the contamination found on the northern portion of the facility was due to other activities not directly related to treating of the wood or drippage from the wood, the treated wood. And therefore, our RCRA program, in conjunction with the State Superfund program, determined that contamination of soil on that portion of the facility outside of the treatment area and in the south is not a RCRA listed waste and can be disposed of in a solid waste facility. Do we have any additional questions? Okay, because I don't want to cut you guys off here, but I know we'll want to get to the statement portion too in a little bit.
Question about, I'm sorry, Tony Tweedale. Thank you. Question about the hauling to the BFI landfill. Since the dioxins have a somewhat useful signature that they come from Penta, and since there's documented leachate at the landfill that extends on the southern side of I-90, which compresses the ground, but nevertheless the leachate has already gotten into the main aquifer by passing under I-90. I would ask what plans there are to monitor the leachate for these particular contaminants, which potentially may be detectable in the landfill leachate.
You know, I'm not sure I can answer your question in full here tonight. One thing that I will say is that every landfill in Montana has monitoring requirements, particularly ones from where there's already been a documented release of contaminants from the landfill. There's some pretty rigorous monitoring requirements that our solid waste program requires. I cannot tell you, Tony, tonight if the monitoring includes dioxin, and we'll have to get back to you on that because I don't know all of the analyses that the solid waste program is requiring from BFI, but that is something we can get back to you on.
Denise Alexander. I wanted to ask a question about liability. Huddig, I guess, is the original owner of this property, and I'm assuming is the liable party for the Superfund cleanup. But what happens as the properties change hands, which they already have? I mean, the city owns a part of it. Scott Street Development, I think, is selling property to Sparrow Group, and I just don't quite understand when you do have this no further action, we'll assume that that's going to happen, and you had said that that's always conditional, that there can always be new, that if there's a new information, there still can be action taken later. And would Huddig be still liable, even though the property has changed ownership?
Huddig, am I on? Okay. Huddig will be liable in perpetuity at this facility for any contamination that exists. Other liable parties or potentially liable parties do include some current owners. For example, Scott Street Partners in the city of Missoula, while they have not received notice because we're working with Huddig, are potentially liable for the cleanup under the state Superfund statute. One of the things that we have heard concerns about is potential liability for future residential purchasers of the property, assuming that the development goes through. The state Superfund law has very specific liability exclusions for residential property owners. So if this development were to go through, construction occurred, people bought houses, moved in, leased apartments or whatever, and we found out that there were more contamination problems out there and we needed to reopen the facility and look at it again, those residential owners are not going to be liable under the state Superfund law. Your liability would go back to the other prior parties that we've already talked about, Huddig and potentially the city, potentially Scott Street Partners, and potentially Sparrow, if there was something that we found that they hadn't disclosed or something like that. But that liability, except in an extraordinary circumstance, will not pass to residential property owners in the future.
Thank you. This is kind of more of a practical question. When we look at the blue road, the clean road, and I think Denise expressed something about this too earlier, it doesn't have a turnaround at the end like the green road does. And I was trying to figure out how the trucks, I mean, are they going to be just driving over the clean fill as they're unloading? Do they get unloaded by loaders, or are they dump trucks? And besides that, how do the trucks get turned around at the end of the road?
That's a good question. The trucks, the thing to realize is that the trucks with clean fill material will not begin to bring clean fill material down this road until that area 1 and area 2 are cleared, sampled, and demonstrated to meet the residential standards. At that point, the trucks will come down this road, and once they get to area 2, they can drive, usually for compaction, it's usually belly dump trucks. I mean, the stuff comes out of the bottom, and it's easiest to blade it and then compact it. And with the depths that we're talking about there, that's the way we envision it. Until we have the contractor on board, it might change. It might be dump trucks. It might be not belly. It might be top loading down dump trucks. But this area will be cleared for, determined to be clean before any trucks drive on that area. And that blue road will be a bladed in clean gravel road that will be placed there. Does that make sense?
So I guess they will be driving over the cleaned area.
They'll be driving over the cleaned area.
And then that's where they would get turned around
Correct.
to leave and everything.
Correct.
Does anybody have any other questions? Because I'd like to take a brief break if nobody does and come back and accept statements that folks may still have that they would like to make to DEQ. The statement portion, we would really just expect to receive statements from folks in the audience, and DEQ would not be responding or answering questions during that period of time. So if you have any other burning last-minute questions here, I'd ask that you come forward now so that we can move on. I know folks have been wonderful to sit here for this long of a period of time, and we still would like to hear if you have other statements you would like to make. Okay, not seeing anyone trying to rise from their seat, let's take a quick 5-minute break and then come back and accept statements.
Discuss construction that's going to start from Patty Street, where they ended construction off of 39th Street up to South Avenue. New curbs, gutters are going in along where that new student housing is. We also discussed that we're going to do a ice cream social with when the students come.